Well, here we are, another week, another troubling parable. This week, it's from Matthew 22, verse 1 to 14. And it's worth reminding ourselves about parables that they are intended to provoke thought and questioning, and that we shouldn't fall into the trap of straight allegory, that they can have different elements and ideas. In the case of this parable, when you read it, we must particularly avoid thinking that because the king in the parable represents God, we must avoid thinking that Jesus is therefore saying that God acts exactly as this fictional king. If you haven't watched the video about parables, you might want to go and to do that now. I'll try to attach the link somewhere around this. Well, I've heard of some wedding fails, but the one in Jesus' story today would really take the wedding cake. Let's start with context. This passage starts, Jesus said to them, and it's vital to identify the them in this passage, and without that identification, we can fall into some really quite horrifying ways of thinking, and it can lend credence to some quite appalling supersessionism and anti-Semitism. But to identify who them is within this passage, we have to go back to chapter 21, verse 23, when the religious authorities of the day questioned Jesus about the authority that he has. Remember, he turned that back on them and asked them about their response to John the Baptist. This passage we have today is a continuation of that conversation, that quite lengthy conversation. So the critique that Jesus offers, and it is a doozy, is not against ordinary people of faith, but instead against the elites who ought to have known better. Another bit of context. There are wedding guests in this story who behave abominably, ending in them mistreating and murdering the servants of the king. But then the king's response seems out of all proportion to the crime those people committed. Because of their crime, the whole city is burnt. How is that just? What about all the people of that city who weren't murderers? Of course, it is particularly troubling since we almost always have that mental equivalence in parables that a king is an allegory for God. Hence my reminder about the trap of reading a parable as straight allegory. Reading this from my nice, safe, warm, mostly dry house in a peaceful city, I have the luxury of thinking, what a terrible thing for a king to threaten to do in the future. But that's my privilege at work. For the first hearers of the gospel, the destruction of their city was not a threat for the future, but an historical event that they had recently lived through. They are trying to make sense of trauma. Experts suggest that this is part of the current appeal of conspiracy theories, this human urge to have a narrative that makes sense of traumatic events. For those first hearers of the gospel, they might be hearing from this parable that, despite the destruction that has been wrought, God is still in charge, and there is still a place at the table for them, despite this calamity. Transformation. But this is a parable, so get ready for yet another twist. The story doesn't end at all being welcomed at the feast now that the invitation is extended to all the people. I've always really felt for this unprepared wedding guest. Fancy being thrown out into the outer darkness with weeping and gnashing of teeth for a fashion faux pas. As a deeply daggy person, this fills me with fear. But of course, this is a parable, and I think something we must take from this is that we must allow that invitation to transform us. Transformation must be a lifelong process. You will have heard of the Billy Graham Crusades, or perhaps you or someone close to you even remembers them. They were a wonderful time for many participants of a real growth in their faith. But it is easy to take away from events like that a misunderstanding of what it means to be Christian. To live a Christian life is not to be converted once, but to be continually converted into the image of God. We must continually make the countercultural choice to treat all others as a child of God alongside ourselves, regardless of whether or not we agree with them. This is essentially impossible using our own human resources. Instead, it is God at work within us. We make the choice to open ourselves to God performing that work. Anticipation changes our current reality. Among the things I'm struggling with during lockdown is the lack of anything to look forward to with anticipation. This past week we've had wonderful news. My sister in Germany is going to be married to her long-term partner. It's a long way off, this wedding. May 2022 is the plan, all being well, borders reopening and so on. But while it is at least more than 18 months away, there are no venues chosen, there are no flights booked. I've already noticed how anticipating this event, long in the future though it is, does change my attitude and behaviour in the here and now. This is very much in keeping with what the current consensus of research by psychologists and experts in human brain and behaviour are telling us. In fact, what we are learning about neuroplasticity, that is, the brain's ability to change its very structures, it may be the case that thinking with an optimistic worldview changes our brain at a physical level. Jesus and the prophets often speak of God's kingdom as like a feast. Jesus often said that living in anticipation of that great feast changes our reality day to day. It feels to me like another one of those situations where our faith tells the truth of meaning and science has come through in discovering the mechanisms at play. May we all be transformed more and more by our sure and certain hope that God's kingdom is coming. May we know there is a place at the table for us. May we know there is a place at the table for all. Goodbye and God bless.